So I've already made one video about appreciating comics and what our brains do when we read a comic. I want to do another one of those, go a little bit more in depth. The first example I want to show you is from a really great series of comics called 100 Bullets. The artist here is Eduardo Risso. The writer is Brian Azzarello. And I just want to show you guys one page. And I don't really want to talk too much about what the story is all about because, and it's a great story, but it's not really my point here. I just want to point out the storytelling. Now, comics are done, oftentimes they're collaborative efforts where you have a writer and an artist. Sometimes, somebody both writes and draws. Sometimes there are two artists. There's the penciler and then there's the inker. Because pencils don't reproduce very well. There's also a colorist. And again, sometimes one person does multiple jobs. Now, the way that comics are written, from my understanding, sometimes a writer will just give, some of the comics that Stan Lee, you may have heard of Stan Lee, one of the main guy behind Marvel Comics. He would write a plot outline. It's like, this is what I want to have happen in the book. And then the artist would just go ahead and draw it all out, and then Stan Lee would add in all the text and dialogue, what everybody needs to say. And then you'd get a letterer to actually hand letter all that stuff. So anyway, that's one way of doing it. Some writers, they break it down page by page, and they say exactly what they want on every single panel. Some of them are super detailed, and they say exactly what they want the panel to look like, what the angle needs to be. Some of them give the artists a little bit more free reign. Some of them will get more specific for some types of scenes and less specific for other types of scenes. I'm sure there's probably a lot of variety there that I'm leaving out because, I'm not a comics professional. But, from what I've read, I've been reading interviews and listening to interviews with various writers and artists over the years. So I know there's a variety here. So how much of what I'm going to point out here is due to the way that Brian Azzarello, the writer, laid it out versus Eduardo Risso? I don't know. I don't know what the process was between the two of them. But the one thing that's for sure is that this is an excellent example of the collaborative process. Because, again, you don't really need to know the story here. If you just look at this page, this is what is good comics. Because by looking at this, even if you don't read any of the text, you get a good sense of what's going on. Bad comics is when you open up the page and you're confused. And as a longtime fan of comics, I know that sometimes I would give a comic to some people. And it's strange to me where people would say, oh, I don't even know how to read this. Which, I don't know, I've been reading comics since I was a little kid. Sometimes I can't blame them, though, because the panel structure, the storytelling is confusing. You can't really tell what's going on. But in this case, you get a good sense. And just notice the way this is all laid out here, where we got in the first panel, we got the overhead view. We clearly know where we are. We know where the setting is. Even though you didn't read the page before, we know we're in a diner. There's just enough there to let us know what we need to know about the setting. By the next panel, we focus in, so you don't need to worry about that one guy who's just sitting there with his coffee or that one lady with her eggs. You just go ahead. We're focusing in on these people. Most specifically, this guy's bringing out this briefcase. Obviously, that must have some significance to the scene. The conversation is getting a little bit more intense and serious as it goes on in the second row of panels there. Clearly, this conversation is having more of an emotional impact on her than it is for him. He's got a bit of a wry smile there, indicating that perhaps there's a little more going on here than he's willing to let on. But clearly, he's getting some kind of pleasure out of this. His reaction, it's enigmatic is probably a better way to describe it. With her, it's clear, it's emotional, it's upsetting her. With him, it's like, okay, who is this guy and what is he all about? And that brilliant sequence at the very end where she grabs what looks like perhaps are some pictures. You see that ominous gun there as well. And again, notice those last two panels. No dialogue, no text. You don't need it. It tells you, the picture tells you everything you need to know. Clearly what she is looking at is distressing. It is absolutely devastating what she is seeing. And of course, the shadow on her face adds to the overall mood of the darkness, the seriousness. Really, really brilliant stuff. Some other things I want to point out to you. I've mentioned Prince Valiant before. There have been some wonderful collected editions of Prince Valiant and Hal Foster's work. I just want to point out one page in particular here. Notice the panel in the middle. This is another good example of what comics can do that other forms of art can't. Notice how you can change the dimensions of the panels. Again, when you're watching a movie, you can't really do that. You kind of have the screen and you've got that, there's a lot you could do within that. But with comics, you can change the dimension of the panels and you can use that effectively for storytelling. And this is such a brilliant shot of Prince Valiant escaping from this castle here. It's so great how Hal Foster used the entire vertical space there to give you a good sense for the height that he's jumping from, which gives us a good sense for the bravery, the daring. If we just, cut off the panel much higher up, you would get the sense, you would understand that he's escaping from the castle. But by using all that space there, we really realize just how far it is he's jumping and how dangerous this is and how desperate the situation is. Again, Hal Foster, enough can't be said about him and the amount of detail that he puts in his work. Can't recommend these enough, or get at least one if you're into comics. A more recent graphic novel that came out. If you like comics and you like the Beatles, you got to read this. It's The Fifth Beatle. It's about their manager, actually, Brian Epstein. Of course, the Beatles themselves are in it. But again, this is such a great example of, every single page feels like it's a different book. In some ways, there's a lot of experimenting with panel layouts and structure. Some, pages have very few panels. Some pages have a lot of them. But the one that really just struck me, and I got to meet the artist here, Andrew Robinson, and I may have geeked out a little bit because I was just telling him how much I loved it. And I specifically talked about these pages right here. Again, there are words, but there are just enough words, to convey the dialogue. But with this, the third panel down there, clearly he is seeing something that is having an effect on him that's a bit stronger than the other folks. And you see down at the bottom, there are the Beatles back in their early days when they were just a small band playing in Liverpool there. And as we turn the page, the band gets a little bit bigger. We get a better look at them. Now, with the bullfighting, I don't want to talk too much about that, but this is not, there isn't a bullfight going on in the Cavern Club in Liverpool, too. This is symbolic for what's going on, and comics can use symbols in a really effective way, but I don't want to get too into the weeds with that right now. But again, notice how it keeps repeating the panel. Once again, we see his face. It's closer up than it was the last time. And then the next page here, it's just the band, and then even closer on his face. He is getting a very emotional, very visceral reaction out of this band, like he's never seen anything like this in his life. Again, there's no text that's explaining all of that. Maybe someone else looking through this might describe it a little bit differently than I am. But this is what I'm getting out of it. I think somebody, even if they use different words, I think ultimately they'd be saying the same thing. Because it's allowing the pictures to tell the story. The text tells you a little bit more. It tells you what you need to know to tell the entire story. But again, this moment here, this scene, it doesn't need to tell you, there's 4 young men up there playing in a band. You don't need it. It's there. And it's clearly you're at a concert. Speaking of concerts, another really great use of this, of a concert scene done in comics form, is from one of my absolute favorite series of graphic novels, Scott Pilgrim. Now, these were originally printed in black and white. This is the color edition, and no knocking black and white. Some of my favorite comics are in black and white. However, I really think that color was put to good use in this edition, and it, some people might be mad at me for saying it improves it. It certainly enhances the storytelling. So we take a look here. Again, text doesn't matter so much here, but clearly we have, if you've ever been to a concert, this is exactly what it's like. You're waiting for the band, you've got the empty stage there, you might see the drum set, whatever. It's very, very dark. We see our characters there, and I love that last panel. You just see the shoes of the lead singer coming out. Now, to know a little bit about the story here, the lead singer of this band had broken up with our main character, Scott Pilgrim, so there's a bit of an emotional... he's not just seeing any concert, he's seeing a concert being performed by somebody who he had a relationship with. And again, this brings me to the concerts that I've seen, because there's this palpable excitement when you actually see the band getting up on stage and they're getting their instruments and they're getting ready. Again, very dark. Notice how she walks with confidence. And again, you see his face right there. He's got his eyes wrapped on there because this was someone who broke his heart. You see the other audience members with various reactions. Some people are a little more excited than others. Clearly, this one person is extremely excited. She's got literal stars in her eyes. You see, notice how each one of these panels, you do see the singer. She's only the focus in the first one. You can maybe say the last one, although she has her back turned. But you do see her, or at least a little bit, in each one as she's stepping out. And then when you turn the page, again, a good use of, going from one page to the next with, a pacing here. Because the next page, so we went from all these dark colors to boom, although actual sound effect, zah. Notice all of a sudden, bright colors just jumping out at you. And again, in the black and white, still the overall effect, you get a sense for the excitement of all this if this wasn't black and white. But I really think going from dark colors to bright colors with the turn of the page, that really, it has an impact that, again, I don't know how you do this in another art form. I suppose you could do it in movies by having everything dark and then suddenly going bright, but you also kind of, burn the audience's eyes a little bit when you do that. And again, you're not having the audience participate in the pacing here, because, how fast this hits you depends on how fast you turn the page. And again, you can live this and relive it as I have. Notice also how you've got the three musicians there, but she, again, the focus of our main character's attention, she is stepping out of the panel. The closest thing you could do to this in movies is you got 3D. I'm not a huge fan of 3D. I've seen some movies use it to better effect than others, but again, it's not quite the same thing. But she is, again, bursting with confidence. She's stepping out of the panel. She is larger than life. And then the last one, I have it here in my huge collection of Spider-Man comics. This collects the entirety of the original team, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, their entire run. It's quite a hefty tome. This has been analyzed again and again and again by various people as an example of comic storytelling and this talent of Steve Ditko. You may recall, Stan Lee, he just gave kind of a, plot description of what he wanted the entire comic to be. And it's really Steve Ditko's storytelling. Now, some people, they think that this could do without Stan Lee's dialogue. I happen to be a big fan of the way Stan Lee writes. It's a bit... It's a language unto itself. It's not really realistic, but, neither is Shakespeare's language, and I love Shakespeare's language. I'm not saying that this is quite as elevated, but you know what? I like it just as much, and ultimately that's what matters the most when it comes to art. How it affects you as the audience. And let me just kind of go through the pictures first, and then, gosh darn it, I'm going to pay a little tribute to Stan here and read his dialogue. Now, if you saw Spider-Man Homecoming, they essentially recreated the scene. And I think they did a great job of it because they did not do it exactly the same. They used what works well in a movie versus what works in a comic. And you might recall in that movie where Spider-Man is trapped under all that rubble and he has to push himself up and he has to psych himself into it. There's no way that wasn't a tribute to this. But again, I'm glad they didn't do it exactly the same because it wouldn't. Because it's not the same. Movies are movies and comics are comics. But still, the feeling is still there. That both versions get the same feeling, the emotion across in their own way. But with a comic, it can kind of slow down the moment a little bit here. And you see Spider-Man. I mean, you see him struggling from the first panel to the second. He is ready to give up. But no, he's getting back, and now he's thinking. And again, if you just look at the pictures, he's thinking of his Aunt May there. She is sick. She needs some medicine. He's thinking of his Uncle Ben. If you know the whole story of Spider-Man, you know the significance of that. Again, he's got that fist there, that fist of determination. And he's gearing up in the next page, and he's pushing, and he is pushing as we go to the next panel. And he's starting to get a little bit of leverage there. He's getting himself up a little bit, getting himself up. And you can see the water is coming in and the water is pouring on his head. Again, whether that was Stan Lee's idea, most likely it was probably Steve Ditko's. I mean, it's bad enough when you got all this debris on your head. It's even worse when there's water flooding down on you. And he struggles, and look, as he's starting to push it up. And then, of course, you know, what you can do with panels. You know, before we had many panels on a page, and then when we get to the end of this, because it's a big moment, it's just one page, him doing it. So I'm just going to go from the very beginning there, because again, I like Stan Lee's dialogue. I wish I could do a Stan Lee impersonation. But I've got to try to free myself, no matter how impossible it seems. And lifting is the only way. The only way. I can't. So exhausted. After all that fighting, I feel so weak. But then, the amazing teenager glimpses the life-saving serum. So near, yet so far away. So hopelessly far away. It's lying there, just beyond reach, as though mocking me, taunting me. It's the one thing, the only thing that may save Aunt May, and I can't bring it to her. If she doesn't make it, it'll be my fault. Just the way I'll always blame myself for what happened to Uncle Ben. And got a little side note there. For the momentous tale of Spidey's origin. Remember, Stan? The two people in all the world who've been kindest to me. I can't fail again. It can't happen a second time. I won't let it. I won't. No matter what the odds, no matter what the cost, I'll get that serum to Aunt May. And maybe then I'll no longer be haunted by the memory of Uncle Ben. Within my body is the strength of many men. And now I've got to call on all that strength, all the power that I possess. I must prove equal to the task. I must be worthy of that strength, or else I don't deserve it. The weight is unbearable. Every muscle aches. My head, it's spinning. Everything's beginning to whirl around. The strain, it's unbearable. And again, the pictures, they tell the same thing that he's saying. So I understand why some people think that it doesn't need the dialogue. But again, I like it. For me, it works. The crack in the ceiling, it's growing wider, getting bigger every second. I'll never make it. I can't. No, I dare not give up now. If I close my eyes, I'll go under. Must stay awake. Must clear my head. Keep trying. Trying. I'll do it, Aunt May. I won't fail you. No matter what, I won't fail. Anyone can win a fight when the odds are easy. It's when the going's tough, when there seems to be no chance. That's when it counts. Everything going black. My head aching. Hold on. I must hold on. It's moving. Can't stop now. Last chance. Must keep the momentum. More. Just a little more. And then, as the agonizing ache in his limbs seem unendurable, as his superbly muscled body suffers the torment of a virtually indescribable ordeal, from out of the pain, from out of the agony, comes triumph. I did it! I'm free! Now, I could argue that maybe that text in the yellow there, the caption, that one I could do without. This picture is telling you that just fine on its own. It doesn't hurt. Again, there's something about the way Stan Lee writes. Some of his turn of phrase. It's a little hokey, a little cheesy, but I think it would probably work just fine without it. I do like his "I did it, I'm free," even though obviously that's what's happening. But I believe that he would say that as he's finally pulling himself out of all this. So there you go. Read comics, people. They're wonderful.